Well, the last time the military took control was in 1988, and of course it ruled for up until 2010. So it's been a while, but over the past few months, it's become increasingly clear that the military was unhappy with the NLD, the National League for Democracy in government. It was very unhappy with the results of the 2020 elections, which returned an NLD government to power. And it was unhappy with, I think, also the peace process, because it did appear that after the elections, that ethnic armed groups were willing to acknowledge the NLD government and to work with them, and that likewise the NLD government had indicated that it was going to form a national unity government, and it had made statements to the effect that it was going to, be working really hard on the peace process going forward. And I think the military in many ways felt like that had cut them out of the picture. In addition, there's the Commander-in-Chief, Min Aung Hlaing, who had ambitions to be president. Of course, that wasn't going to be possible, and he also faced the dilemma that he was supposed to step down this year because he'd turned 65, and that was the retirement age for the position of Commander-in-Chief. So there were big questions there about what he was going to do, whether he would be willing to step down. And of course, a coup now goes entirely in his favour, and in his opinion, all power is now his as the Commander-in-Chief under what they're saying is a constitutional emergency. Because this coup does appear to have been well planned, I think this is going to be the status quo for some time. At the moment, of course, the military has said this will be the case for a year. I think it's unlikely that we're going to hear from Aung San Suu Kyi, who's been arrested, the president or other members of the government who are now under arrest. And of course, we face the added challenge that information is difficult to obtain at the moment, with various media channels either closed and at times the internet being unreliable. As a result of yesterday's coup, it seems clear that the military has acted quickly to put in place new structures. It's issued a raft of orders and notifications and announcements, installing a new temporary president, forming a new peace committee, forming a new National Defence and Security Council. And so it appears that it has had all these plans in place, and that this is now the governance structure that we're looking at going forward for the short term. Yeah, it seems fairly clear that early Monday morning, many of the key leaders, including the president and Aung San Suu Kyi, were arrested. And they have now, lost the positions that they had in government, and the military has been fairly clear that Parliament has been dissolved. In addition, of course, I should say the powers that the military is claiming to exercise also dissolve the courts and most other institutions. And so what the military has done in the last few hours is to reconstitute the courts. So it has issued announcements saying, there are new judges forming the courts. It has somewhat bizarrely announced that there will be a National Human Rights Commission re-established, an anti-corruption commission. So all the sorts of facade, if you like, of a government are being reinstated, but very much under the military's control and at the military's pick. There's clearly strong popular support for the National League for Democracy and Aung San Suu Kyi. I think at the moment, in the confusion and chaos, opinions are undecided as to, I guess, what to do next or what is the best strategy for resistance. While there were some indications online that perhaps, protests or demonstrations might be organised, there have also been concerns that perhaps some of those posts have actually been fake news. So there's a lot of misinformation out there at the moment, actually, and I think it's a challenge for any groups that want to oppose this coup to do so in a united way and in a way where people are acting on consistent or reliable information. I guess one scenario is that the military might do what it says. It will rule for a year and then it claims that it will hold an election. And I believe it needs to do so within 6 months of the constitutional emergency ending, or the constitutional emergency that it claims exists. I think there's a big question as to whether they would allow the National League for Democracy to run as a political party. But there's also questions about whether the National League for Democracy would be willing to run in an election. I mean, to keep in mind, of course, that in the 2010 elections, the National League for Democracy refused to participate because at the time it was still unconvinced about the military's plans to transition politically. And it was only in 2012 and then 2015 where the NLD fully began to participate in the system that the military had created. No doubt in coming days, Western governments will be reconsidering whether to impose sanctions once again. Of course, Myanmar was in this position before in the late 1990s and 2000s when many Western countries did impose sanctions. I think Western countries are likely to be looking at very targeted sanctions, particularly against the commander-in-chief or other high-level military officers who are clearly holding power at the moment. I think the added challenge for the West, though, is to think about the COVID-19 situation and the fact that Myanmar is in a very fragile state and that its population is very vulnerable at this point, I think. So there is a real, I guess, need to balance the desire for sanctions and to show a strong message and to, I guess, condemn Myanmar in the harshest possible terms, while at the same time acknowledging that for the people of Myanmar are still very much facing a health crisis. They're still very much facing an economic crisis as a result of COVID-19. And I don't think Western action should be in any way compromising the aid and support that Myanmar is needed in that regard. At the moment, I think ASEAN is divided and it comes down to some of the individual positions of countries within ASEAN. ASEAN has issued a statement since the coup, and I think somewhat predictably, it has fallen back on some of the, I guess, core principles of ASEAN and the need for stability overall. So it was very much a minimal statement, if you like. Some individual countries within ASEAN have been more explicit, and particularly Indonesia is the key one. They have urged the Myanmar government to respect the results of the elections. And I think here their statement was based on Indonesia's kind of stance and position in the region as a country that has prided itself on elections. One of the challenges in Myanmar, I think, is that a small number of people have benefited both from the prior military regime, but also from the past 10 years. And there's actually been some great reporting by both Amnesty International and a group called Justice for Myanmar, who have in recent weeks and months exposed some of the military's current economic interests, its companies and land it owns and so on. And in particularly how that links back to the commander-in-chief and other key officers. So I think that is a clear indication that a lot of the wealth and the benefits, if you like, of the transition and some of the business transactions that have gone on has yet again flowed back to the military. And so I think it's very difficult to compete with that if you're someone who if you're someone who is not part of those business interests and of that small group of people who've really taken advantage of the country and of the transition and the economic benefits that it offers. So to go back to your question as to whether this cycle can be broken. I mean, on one hand, Myanmar is not quite like Thailand. Obviously in Thailand, we see much more regular coups. And yet in Myanmar, a lot of what has been happening this time around does have echoes of the 1990s. And so I think there is a real sense in Myanmar that this is a repeat of history, and there's a real frustration about how or whether that cycle can ever be broken.